They laughed when he kept his 1938 Farmall. When fuel prices tripled, he was the only one working. The embargo came in October of 1973. Walter Brandt heard it on the kitchen radio. He was 63 years old, had farmed the same 240 acres in Saline County, Nebraska, since his father died in the winter of 1946. The morning was cold. Frost stood white on the fence wire. The stove smelled of last night's ash. Walter set his coffee down and listened. The man on the radio said oil, said shortage, said the price was going to climb. Esther kept washing the breakfast plates and said nothing. She had heard hard news on that radio before. Walter went out to the machine shed, pulled the canvas tarp off the tractor. It was a 1938 Farmall F20. He had bought it new the autumn he married Esther. Paid $1,050 for it at the dealership in Crete. 35 years ago that fall. The tractor was small. The red paint had faded to the color of dried brick. It pulled a two-bottom plow. 23 horsepower on a warm day. The seat was a steel pan worn smooth by half a lifetime. He set the spark, gave the crank 3 turns, and it caught the way it always caught. The neighbors had stopped taking the Farmall seriously a long time before that. By 1973, nobody else in the township farmed with a tractor that old. The big men ran diesel. Air seats, enclosed cabs with radios in them, power steering and lights for night work. Walter ran a steel seat and a hand crank, and a magneto he cleaned with the blade of his pocket knife. The advice from Washington that year was simple: get big or get out. The men who set policy wanted fence-row to fence-row corn. They wanted machines that swallowed 40 acres in a day. Walter covered 8 on a good day, 10 if the ground was dry. He did it the same way he had done it through the war, when there was no help and no new steel to be had. He had reasons he never bothered to explain. The Farmall was paid for. It had been paid for since 1941. He could fix it himself, every bolt of it, on a bench in the shed. It burned almost nothing. None of that had ever seemed worth saying out loud. So he did not say it. He just kept the tractor under the tarp and brought it out when there was work. Lyle Novak farmed the half section across the road. Novak had bought a new John Deere 4430 in the spring of 1973. Paid $19,500 for it. Financed every dollar through the bank in Crete over 11 years. The 4430 had 125 horsepower. It had a cab a man could heat in winter. Parked next to it, the F20 looked like something a child had left in the yard. Novak was not cruel about it. He just laughed. Most of them laughed. They would meet Walter on the gravel, the little F20 putting along at 4 miles an hour, a wagon behind it, and they would lift 2 fingers off the wheel and smile to themselves. An old man on an old tractor. Pleasant enough. Behind the times, they had grain to haul and bigger lives to live. Roy Hollenbeck laughed the loudest, and Hollenbeck of all of them should have known better. Hollenbeck ran the International Harvester dealership in Crete. He sold the very brand that had built Walter's Farmall. He had tried to sell Walter a new tractor 4 times across 6 years. The last time was the spring of 1972. Hollenbeck wanted $14,800 for a new International 1066. 125 horsepower, factory cab, the works. Walter looked it over and said the Farmall did what he needed. Hollenbeck looked at the F20 sitting in his lot and told 2 other farmers, loud enough for Walter to hear, that the old thing belonged in a museum. They all had a good laugh about it. Walter drove the Farmall home and put it back under the tarp and said nothing. 3 weeks after the embargo began, the price of fuel started to move. Farm diesel at the Crete Cooperative had been 21 cents a gallon that spring. By December it was 34. By February it touched 46. The co-op manager told anyone who would listen that it was not done climbing. He was right. He would be right for years. But price was only half of the trouble. The other half was supply. By January of 1974, the co-op was rationing what came off the truck. Each farm got an allotment by the month. The big diesel operators burned through theirs in days. A John Deere 4430 pulling a chisel plow drank close to 6 gallons an hour. Run it 10 hours, and that was 60 gallons gone. 60 gallons out of an allotment that was meant to carry a man for 30 days. Novak's tractor sat, not because it was broken, because there was nothing left to pour into it. A few men tried to get around it. One fellow east of Wilbur hauled diesel in barrels from a county 2 over, paid a premium for it, then paid again in fines when the allocation office found out. Another mortgaged a quarter to keep his big rig fed and his note current, both at once. That was the conventional answer. Spend more to keep the big machine alive. It did not work. The more a man spent chasing fuel, the deeper the hole got, and the machine still sat most days regardless. The men who had laughed in the spring of 1973 were not laughing by February of 1974. More than half the township had borrowed against new equipment. The payments came due whether the steel moved or not. A 4430 cost the same to own sitting still as it did running. A combine in the shed still drew interest. Now the machines sat most of the winter, because the fuel was short, and the fuel was dear, and the bank in Crete did not care which. Walter's Farmall ran on gasoline. The F-20 was the gas model, not the all-fuel one. That small fact came to matter more than anyone could have guessed. The co-op had diesel trouble all winter long. Gasoline came easier, and the little tractors sipped where the big ones gulped. The shortage reached into town that winter too. The filling station in Crete ran out 2 afternoons a week. There were odd days and even days, and lines down the street, and a sign in the window when the pumps went dry. None of it touched Walter much. He drove to town once a week, if that. The Farmall did not need town. It needed a tank of gasoline a man could carry in a single can, and a wipe of the points, and an even hand on the throttle. The whole machine had been built in a year when fuel was something a farmer thought about, and it had never forgotten how to make a little of it go a long way. The F-20 burned about 1.5 gallons an hour. Walter worked his ground slow and even, the way he always had, never pushing it past what it wanted to do. In a full season, he put maybe 300 gallons through the tractor. The whole year, Novak's 4430 could burn that much in 11 days of real field work. So when the price tripled, the numbers told the whole story without anyone having to argue it. 300 gallons, even at the new price, came to a figure Walter could pay out of the egg money and the cream check. Novak's fuel bill, even rationed down to nothing, climbed past anything the corn could ever carry. The math stopped working for the big iron. The math had never been a problem for the small. And Walter owned his outright. Free and clear since 1941. No payment. No note. No banker in Crete holding the title in a drawer. The tractor cost him nothing to keep through the winter, but a tarp, a little grease, and a place out of the weather. Novak owed 11 more years on the 4430. He owed them whether it rained or shined. The spring of 1974 came late and came wet. The ground did not dry until the second week of May. When it finally turned workable, every farmer in Saline County wanted into the field on the same morning. That was when the thing showed itself plain for anyone to see. The big tractors would not run. Some had no fuel left in the allotment. Others had fuel but had broken down over the winter and could not be fixed. The parts were back-ordered. The factories were short too, caught in the same squeeze. A water pump for the 4430 was 9 weeks out. A hydraulic seal kit ran longer than that. Hollenbeck's parts counter had a clipboard full of farmers' names and almost nothing on the shelf to give them. Walter pulled the tarp off the Farmall on the 8th of May. Greased every fitting. Checked the magneto points with the blade of his pocket knife, the way his father had shown him. Set the spark. Turned the crank. It caught on the second pull. He was in the field by 7 that morning. He was the only tractor moving on his whole stretch of road. The days fell into a shape after that. Walter rose at 4:30. Coffee at the stove while it was still dark. Out to the shed by 6 to grease the fittings and set the spark. In the field by 7. Every morning, fog or frost or sun. He worked until noon, came in for dinner and a half hour off his feet, then went back out until the light gave up. 15, 16 hours some days. The tractor never complained, and it never quit, and at the end of each day he wiped it down and checked the oil and left it ready for the next. The Farmall was simple. That was the secret nobody had bothered to value back in 1972. It had a magneto, not an alternator, and a battery, so a dead battery on a cold morning meant nothing at all. It had a hand crank for the same reason. Its parts were iron, and they were few, and they had not changed in 35 years. Walter had been fixing it himself since before the war. In all that time he had never once called the dealer for a repair. In the loft of the machine shed he kept a wooden crate. Inside the crate were parts. A spare magneto, rebuilt and wrapped in oiled cloth. 2 sets of points. A water pump, piston rings, still in the box. A head gasket. A carburetor kit. He had been gathering them slow for 20 years, a piece at a time, whenever one turned up cheap at a farm sale or an estate auction. People who saw the crate thought he was a man who could not throw anything away. He thought he was a farmer who intended to keep working. While Novak waited 9 weeks on a water pump, Walter could have pulled his own off the loft shelf and had the tractor back in the field by noon. He never had to. The Farmall did not break that spring. It almost never broke. There was little in it left to fail. The first man to come to him was Emil Sedlak. Sedlak farmed 80 acres east of the Catholic cemetery. He was older than Walter, and he had no son left at home to help. His Alice Chalmers had thrown a rod back in March, and the parts for it were nowhere to be found in the state. Sedlak's corn ground sat black and unworked into the 3rd week of May. He came to the Brandt place on a Sunday after Mass. Did not ask straight out, just stood by the open shed and looked at the little red tractor. Walter understood what the standing meant. He plowed Sedlak's 80 acres over the next 4 evenings. After his own day's work was done, the headlights of the pickup pointed across the field so he could see the last of the rows. He charged $6 an acre, the going custom rate. Sedlak tried to press more money on him at the end, and Walter would not take it. Word moved the way word moves in a small county. Through the feed store in Crete. Across the fence lines on a still evening. By the end of May, 3 more men had come to the shed and stood the way Sedlak had stood. Walter worked them all in. The little tractor ran from before light until full dark, day after day, 4 miles an hour, 1.5 gallons each hour, never asking for anything but a quart of oil and a wipe of the points and a fresh tank of gasoline it barely touched. The acres added up in a way no one in the township had predicted. By the 2nd week of June, Walter had finished his own 240 acres and custom worked another 90. By the third week, the custom number reached 190. By the end of the month, it stood at 310. 550 acres worked. All of it on a 36-year-old tractor a dealer had called a museum piece. He had earned $1,960 in custom work alone. He had spent $41 on fuel to do all of it. Lyle Novak's 4430 had run 9 days that whole spring. Hollenbeck Implement felt the year as much as anyone. People had stopped buying tractors they could not fuel. They had stopped buying parts that took 9 weeks to arrive. By midsummer, the dealership in Crete had laid off 2 of its men. The new tractors sat in the lot under a film of road dust, and the bank that floored them began to ask questions. Hollenbeck stopped telling the story about the museum. There was no profit in it anymore, and no audience for it either. There came a day in late June that Walter never said much about afterward. Roy Hollenbeck drove out to the Brandt place, not to sell anything this time. He had a customer near Wilbur, he said, a man whose corn was drowning in weeds and whose cultivating tractor was down waiting on parts. Hollenbeck wondered whether Walter might take the job. Wondered, he said, whether the old Farmall might be free to do it. Walter said he could fit it in the following week. $6 an acre, the same as everyone. Hollenbeck wrote it down on the back of a card. Said thank you. Drove back toward Crete in a pickup with the dealership name painted on the door. He did not laugh, and there was nothing in the visit anywhere for him to laugh at. The man who sold the new iron had come to hire the old. The summer of 1974 turned hot, and the corn came on strong wherever it had been worked in time. Walter cultivated his own ground twice over. The rows ran clean and straight. He had no cab and no air seat and no radio, so he wore a straw hat and tied a wet bandana around his neck. And he stopped at the end of every second round to drink from a canvas water bag that hung swinging on the front fender. The work was slow. It had always been slow. But slow and moving beat fast and parked. And that summer fast was parked all across Saline County. The big machine sat in the shadows of the sheds. The little one ran in the sun. By August, the larger truth had settled over the county like road dust on a still day. The men who had borrowed deep to get big were the men now in trouble. Tripled fuel was only the edge of the blade. The handle was debt. A man with a $19,500 tractor and a $40. 000 combine and an operating note at the bank could not stop the interest by parking the steel. He paid whether he farmed or not, and that year he could barely farm. The fuel saw to that. A man with a paid-off Farmall and a crate of spare parts in the loft paid almost nothing at all, in a good year or a bad one. He had nothing hanging over him that fuel or weather or a banker could pull tight. That was the thing the slogan from Washington had missed. Get big or get out had assumed that big was always strong. It was not. Big was strong only when fuel was cheap and credit was easy and parts came overnight on a truck. Change any one of those three, and big turned into a stone tied around a man's neck. Walter had never picked up the stone. He had nothing to set down. The harvest came in October, a full year after the embargo had begun. Walter did not own a combine. He never had owned one. He still picked his corn on the ear with a 2-row mounted picker that bolted onto the back of the Farmall. People had laughed at that too, back in the easy years. An ear corn picker in the age of the self-propelled combine. But the picker ran on the same gallon and a half an hour, and it ran the day he asked it to run, and the day after that. Walter brought his corn in slow, wagon load by wagon load, crib by crib, the way his father had brought it in before him. The cribs filled to the top. The price of corn that fall was the best it had been in years, lifted by the same forces that had broken his neighbors. He had the crop, and he had the means to gather it, and that put him a long way ahead of men who had 1 and not the other. Emil Sedlak's 80 acres came in too, on account of the plowing in May. Sedlak brought Walter a cured ham at Thanksgiving and would not say why. Walter understood that the same way he understood the standing at the shed. When the books were closed on 1974, Walter Brandt had farmed his own ground, helped 6 of his neighbors get theirs in, and cleared more money in a hard year than he had in most of the easy ones. He had done it on a tractor a dealer had told him to put in a museum. He had done it on $41 of fuel for the spring and not a great deal more for the fall. He never once said he had been right. It was not in him to say it. He just kept turning the crank. Novak sold the 4430 in the winter of 1976. Took a hard loss on it. He bought a smaller used tractor for cash and cut his acres back to what he could carry. He did not blame anyone for it. He leaned on the fence between the two places one evening and told Walter he had figured bigger would always be better. Walter said something short about fuel, and that was the end of the matter. The two men stayed friends to the end. Novak kept a crate of his own spare parts in the shed after that. He had learned the lesson the expensive way. The fuel never did go back down. By 1979, the price at the co-op had tripled clean past where it had started, and then a second crisis pushed it higher still. The men who had come through 1974 saw the second wave rolling in and remembered the first one. Some of them remembered the old man on the little red tractor who had been the only thing moving on the gravel that spring, the year the math turned over and the big iron sat still. Walter farmed his 240 acres until the spring of 1988. He was 78 when he finally hung it up. By then the Farmall had been his for 50 years. He had rebuilt the engine twice in that time, both times by himself, on the bench in the machine shed, working from the parts in the loft. He had never owned a tractor newer than 1938, and he had never once seen a reason to. He sold the home place to a young couple from Lincoln who wanted to raise hogs and keep the old ground in working order. The Farmall went with the farm. Walter showed the young man how to set the spark, how to swing the crank without breaking a thumb. He showed him the crate up in the loft and named each part in it and told him what every one of them was for. The young man kept it all. The tractor, the crate, the picker that bolted on the back. Walter Brandt died in the spring of 1996. The Farmall did not die with him. The young couple kept it running, the way Walter had kept it running, the way Walter's own hands had kept it running since 1938. They used it for chores, for pulling a wagon to the hog lots, for the kind of close work a small tractor still does better than a big one. There is a threshing bee in Saline County every summer. Old machines, run by men who remember when they were new. In 2011, the 1938 Farmall F-20 was there, parked in the line with the others. The red paint faded to the color of dried brick, 23 horsepower of it, catching on the second pull of the crank. A man at the fence asked the owner about the little tractor, asked whether it was only for show. The owner told him no, told him it still worked the ground at home, told him the short version of the story. The embargo, the fuel, the spring it had been the only thing moving on its road. The tractor outlived the man who bought it. It outlived the men who laughed at it. It is still simple, still paid for, still starts on the second pull, still just iron and patience.